God is with you.
And also with you.
So we began last week with, let's see if I can, an exploration of prayer that began with talking about God as something other than a person. We went into some explorations of God as transpersonal or more than personal. This phrase transpersonal comes from the writings of Marcus Borg. But we also talked about the fact that regardless of God not being a person, humans by our very nature tend to personify in order to relate to something. And so images of God as a person or a being help to relate to that which is beyond us. Our images of God only become problematic when we turn that notion, that personified notion of God, into an idol of worship. And I've talked before about the difference between an icon and an idol. An icon points to something beyond itself. An idol, you simply worship the idol. So for example, that cross over there, if we turn the cross, some people would be more familiar with the symbol of a flag, where they worship a flag. Not so much in this country, but in other places the flag gets worshipped. Rather than have the flag or the cross point to something beyond it. So the same thing when we have this image of God as Father, and we begin to worship God as though God is a father. When the feminist movement began, there was the expression that when God is personified as male, the male becomes God. So it has implications for our life in the world. If we're constantly thinking of God as a father or as a stern judge, it has implications for the way in which we relate to others in the world. And so then the icon, the helpful image that points beyond itself of God as a father, becomes an idol. And we then become guilty of idolatry. We do the same thing with the Bible. Some people say, do you believe in the Bible? The correct answer is no. Do you believe in the Bible? I can't tell you how many times I've been asked that, but it sure, especially when I'm wearing this collar, when I say, no, I don't believe in the Bible. Yes?
I think it was very useful when I read recently. The problem isn't the Bible, the problem is us.
Exactly.
And understanding the Bible.
Yes, yes.
And that takes the shift away from so much baggage in terms of, do you believe in the Bible, which is a question that is a setup, is a straw man,
Yeah.
as opposed to saying, the problem is us and our understanding of the Bible.
Yeah. And the other question becomes, do you believe, we ask this question at baptism, so we need not be too smug. There's a question in our baptismal rite. It's not in the way in which we baptize here in this community, but if you look in the hymnal, one of the first questions in the baptismal rite is, do you believe in God the Father? And so unpacking that becomes problematic. And we do have this series of questions that asks, do you believe in God the Father? Do you believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived? The whole thing, right? So those things then become less useful as icons and become almost idolatrous. So we move beyond worshiping God in terms of supernatural theology. So we move beyond worshiping God in terms of supernatural theism, which is just a fancy way of saying personifying God. And I don't know about you, but when I was a child, I didn't have the image of God as a stern father, but as a kind of kindly grandfather. But then I was forbidden to go to church because my parents didn't want me going to church, right? It was the Belfast thing. Too many bad connotations with church. So I think my notion of the male God was a more kinder, gentler God. Did others have the stern judge? No? No? You? Yes, a few over there? Yeah. So when we move beyond supernatural theism to worshiping God as an all-encompassing reality, it becomes a little difficult to know how to pray. God in whom we live and move and have our being is the one to whom we're trying to pray. Well, that's a fairly big concept that we can't wrap our brain around. So how does one relate to that? And so that's what we're going to try to approach today and in our next class. But before we do that, we're going to hear from...
To say the obvious, God is one of the big words in the Christian tradition. And it matters greatly how we think about God. It can make the whole notion of God credible or right on the edge of incredible, and it will very much affect what we think the Christian life is about. And as I think about the word God, it seems to me there are two central questions. The first is, what is the referent of the word God? What do we have in mind? What do people have in mind when they say or hear the word God? And the second big question about God is, what is God like? And I want to talk about both of those. Let me begin with the referent of the word God, what we think the word refers to. And here there are two primary understandings of that word in the Christian tradition, but also in the other religions as well. I grew up with the first of those and basically lived with that first understanding for roughly the first 30 years of my life. And in real shorthand, I thought the word God referred to a being. Now, a super being, to be sure, but a person-like being, somehow separate from the universe, even if also in some ways related to the universe. And I thought of this super being as all-powerful, all-knowing, loving, thought of God as an authority figure, as a lawgiver who also loved us, and as somebody who occasionally intervened, certainly in the great events of the past as recorded in the Bible, but also perhaps in lives even today. Now, a shorthand name for that way of thinking of God is supernatural theism, but that's just shorthand for God is a being. And when I was a child, I took all of this for granted, that this is what the word God meant, and it didn't create any problems for me, except occasional fear, perhaps. You know, it's like a very big parent with a very big stick, okay? And it was only in my teenage years that I began to wrestle with, gosh, is there really a being like that? And in my 20s, the wrestling kind of subsided because I lapsed into what I would call a very comfortable and contented agnosticism. Just not knowing. And I still found the study of all of this absolutely fascinating. So it didn't mean I lost interest in this subject. It's just I wasn't sure at all that there was anything to the notion of God. And then in my early 30s, that all changed. And I came to think of God very differently. So this is the second understanding of the referent of the word God. In very compact language, I began to think of God as the encompassing reality, or if you will, the encompassing spirit. But when I use the word spirit, I don't mean something completely separate from the world. Rather, I see the world as infused with that Spirit. So in language from the book of Acts, I began to think of God as the one in whom we live and move and have our being. That we are in God like fish are in water. Now, the water is also in the fish, but the really important thing is that the fish are in the water. And I came to this understanding not through intellectual effort primarily, but through a series of experiences in my early 30s that I now recognize as mystical experiences. But that's simply a way of saying experiences in which, in my case, I saw whatever I was looking at, the same landscape or the same room, in one case, the same inside of an airline cabin, okay? And it was as if there was light shining through everything. Everything became luminous. And it was radiant but soft all at the same time. And I also experienced a kind of falling away of those sharp boundaries between the self and the world that marks our kind of everyday, ordinary consciousness. And these experiences were accompanied by just amazement and wonder and a sense that I was seeing more clearly than I ever had in my life. They were also full of joy. I could have lived in that state of consciousness forever. Would never have gotten old, I don't think. The longest of them went on for about 40 minutes. Most of them were much, much shorter than that. One was maybe a couple minutes. The other is maybe even just 15 seconds, 30 seconds or something like that. And it was then that I realized that what I call, and what others call, the mystics of all the religious traditions, they call these experiences, such as the one that I had had, experiences of God or the sacred. And suddenly for me, the word God referred to something that was manifestly real. And I don't think I've ever doubted the reality of God ever since those experiences. It's like, you know, somebody asked me, do I believe in God? It'd be like asking me, do I believe in elephants? You know, it's not a matter of believing. It's like, yeah, elephants are. Yeah, God is. Anyway, when we do think of God as a word, a name that points to this wondrous reality that is all around us and that we live within, all of the intellectual problems associated with that first understanding of God basically disappear. It's no longer a question of, is there a being whom we might
So we talked a little bit about our experiences of seeing God in the world and awe and wonder last week. And one of the things that particular clip I wanted you to see illustrates for me is the idea that some folks actually experience God in that kind of luminous, mystical way, and some of us don't. And I suspect that many of us would not frame those experiences in language like mystical experience or sacred experience. One of the things that we have a real difficulty with is naming the holy or the sacred as that, for fear that maybe it was just our blood sugar, or maybe we were experiencing some kind of mental or emotional condition that led us to this place. We have been raised in a fairly skeptical culture where experiences out of the ordinary, we want to explain them away, which is not a bad thing. It's a very good thing, in fact. But I suspect that what that does to us is causes us to have a relationship with the numinous, the divine, if you will, that is more intellectual than it needs to be. It definitely needs to be intellectual, because that's what we are. We're humans, and we need to be able to talk about things, to define things, to put names on them. But there's another level at which we relate to the divine, and we began a little bit about that last week when we talked about awe and wonder. And now I want us to sort of take a moment and pause. And I'm going to ask you to break into groups again, because maybe this might be a little easier to speak about in a group. And we're going to put you in larger groups this time, so there's not so much focus on the individual. Because I'm going to encourage you to, if you've had one of these experiences, to share that. So I'm going to prime the pump again. I'll talk a little bit about my own hesitation around even mentioning the word mystical experience, the phrase mystical experience. You know, when you're at seminary, if you say you've heard the voice of God, that's the ticket out of seminary in a mainline denomination, because it means you're probably not okay, right? You're not able to intellectualize God properly. And for most of my life, I have had an intellectual relationship with the deity. It's been about trying to put words around it, about responding to the awe and wonder that I feel, about the evidence of the Creator when I encounter it. But there have been a number of occasions, and I'm going to describe one of them, that happened to me that I could not explain, that I don't even have adequate words for now. And then I'm going to ask you to break into groups. And if you haven't had that experience, that's okay. If you have had it, you don't feel like sharing it, that's okay as well. But if you have had it and you're brave enough to share it, that's what I'm going to encourage you to do. So it happened to me when I was, I think I was probably 29, 30, and I was coming off a really positive experience with good friends. I went home to my apartment. I had a lovely apartment. I had a great job, so it was coming from a really good place. But I had been to a Buddhist retreat center trying to learn how to meditate, because I had been working at a retreat center for almost 10 years, and I had never had an experience of God. I had never felt that I had seen God. I'd seen evidence of God, but not God. And so I had been searching for that for a long time. And one evening, I went home to my apartment and began to meditate the way in which I had been taught to meditate. Had absolutely no success meditating, and sort of let it go. And had an experience of something that I don't have words for. And the luminosity that Marcus Borg talked about was really clear. And I was at first frightened, but curious. There was a sort of overarching feeling of sort of being, not floating per se, but physically feeling different. And there was also the most amazing joy, followed by deep sadness. It took me a while to figure out why I was sad, and it was because I didn't think the joy could be held on to. And so I was sad because I knew I had to let it go. And when I felt myself letting go of the joy, it came back. And I had no idea how long this lasted for. There was this kind of intense feeling, and I would estimate that it was at least a half an hour, but I don't know. It could have been 2 minutes for all I know. After which, there was a deep sense of peace. It took me a long time to ever be able to look on that experience for what it was. I tried to intellectualize it. I tried to explain it away. I tried to say, it was a reaction to something that I just couldn't identify. It may have been something physical that was going on with my body. I'm okay with that. If that's what it was, that's fine. The reality of the situation is that I now have language for it, and that language comes from reading the mystics. Because once you've had that kind of experience, the desire is to have it again. And it's akin to the kind of desire one feels for a lover. It's all-encompassing. And it doesn't happen often. I'm not going to go into detail about the few other times that it has happened here, but I've shared some of those stories with you in various different ways over the years. But I think that one of the things that we need to do as modern, sophisticated Western thinkers is to begin to name these experiences as experiences that are beyond our ability to explain. There are available explanations, that could explain it away, and I have no problem. If one of those are true, then that's fine. It's not important for me anymore to be able to explain it. It just was. And it continues to nurture me and feed me. And I continue to long for it. So that's as much as I'm going to tell you about my own experience with, which I would call a mystic experience of the sacred. That's the language that I would put around that. Now, there are those who would want to give physical, rational explanations of what those experiences are. That's okay. I have no problem with that. That doesn't make my longing for it any less real, or my experience of it any less real, or the way in which it nurtures me any less real, or my overwhelming understanding, because it's not belief, my overwhelming understanding that was an experience of the numinous. Now, that took me that took decades for me to get to the place where I could say that, right? Because I was, I never once spoke about it when I was at seminary. I've rarely spoken about it since. It's not something I feel the need or I'm compelled to speak about. So I'm going to suggest that you break into groups of, let's do 5, an odd number is good, 5 or 6. And I'm going to invite you, if there's someone in that group who feels comfortable enough to share an experience that they've had that gives them similar thinkings in terms of being an experience of the sacred, of the divine, then by all means let that person share that. If not, if there's no one in the group who has had that experience, then simply describe your reaction to the description of that experience. Is that clear? Good. So I'll let you do. Yeah, go ahead.
Can we just do it by numbering or something? Because we tend to sit with people we know better.
All right. You organize that. You're better at that than I am.
Just go 1 to 5. Just start at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3.
So judging by the levels of of conversation, it appears that there were some experiences to share. Before we get to talking a little bit about those experiences, I'm always So judging by the levels of conversation, it appears that there were some experiences to share. Before we get to talking a little bit about those experiences, I'm always hesitant when I'm having this kind of conversation because for years when people would talk about mystical or sacred experiences, it would be a huge frustration for me because I'd never experienced one. And so I just want to say that the way in which we articulate our experiences varies from person to person, and our experiences vary. We are going to move into practice after this to see how one positions oneself in order to be open to these kinds of experiences. But before we do that, I don't want you to come back into the whole and give me a description of the particular experiences. But what I'd like to do is see if we can throw up here a few of the characteristics of those experiences. So, for example, one of the things I talked about was light. Marcus Borg called it illumination. So any other characteristics of the experiences that were described? Warmth. Anything else?
Fullness.
Fullness.
Full, complete. Fear.
Fear.
Peace.
I should have a scribe here. Peace.
Perfection in the moment.
Thank you, scribe. Perfection in the moment. Other?
Oneness.
Oneness.
With all.
Oneness. Other characteristics of the experiences that were described?
Clarity.
Clarity. Awesome. Okay, so we're getting an idea of the kind of texture and qualities. If you open up another text box there, what I'd like to do now is see if we can get these describe the experience themselves, but what about the person who is experiencing it? Are there any characteristics that came through to you in terms of the person who was experiencing it? Open? Joyful? Other characteristics? Focused? Searching?
Release and tears.
Release and tears? Okay. I certainly think that after my own experiences, I have felt an overwhelming sense of longing for more. And so my question always then is, first of all, I have many questions after an experience like that. And when the sort of emotion dissipates and one begins to think about what actually happened, I tend to rationalize. What happened in my brain was in my brain, and there's got to be a physical explanation for this. It's taken me a long time to let go of that and just function on the level of experience. Now, that's not the only way I choose to function around these experiences, but that's certainly one that we need to flex as a muscle in this Western culture, because we tend to go to the rationalizing really quickly. So in order to sort of wander around in the experience, it's important for us to not go immediately to trying to explain what happened, but rather describe what happened, because we don't spend much time on the descriptive pieces. One of the things that I find interesting about these particular experiences is our reluctance to call them sacred or mystical experiences. And that's probably a good thing. I mean, we certainly know characters who are willing to, I talked to Jesus last night and it was wonderful and he told me this and so and that. I think the sense of skepticism and suspicion is probably very healthy. And so is the desire to rationalize and explain. Okay? So my question about, sorry, you had something there, Anne? What was?
Well, one of the places that I'm pondering at the moment is that that rationalizing and explaining may not diminish it.
No.
And that I used to think that it did. That if I could find a rational explanation, it somehow put it into the realm of, well, that's just.
Yes.
It's nothing but A. And that doesn't, to understand, I mean, that I'm sure physiologically something else is happening because that's part of how we perceive is what's happening in our brains, but that doesn't diminish it.
Yeah. Thank you for that beautiful segue. Because I think that while we need to flex that kind of descriptive feeling side of ourselves, we tend to think that we're making it just something. Now, we've talked about the fact that God is an all-encompassing reality. So if we're able to explain what's physically happening to us, that does not diminish it. Last week we talked about where we had seen God in creation. I mean, I need physics in order to talk about that. I need biology in order to talk about that. I need psychology in order to begin to understand all of that. So applying those wonderful gifts of our minds to these experiences does not diminish them. They're just as real. And by just, I don't mean less than, but just with emphasis. They are just as real when we try to rationalize what it is that they are. And this moves me to my next point, and that is if we are no longer seeing God as a person or a being, but as an encompassing reality, then what does that say about our presence in these experiences? Well, we talked a little bit about open, joyful, focused, searching, release, tears, longing, all those kinds of things. There was an experience of light, warmth, fullness, fear, peace, perfection, in the moment, oneness, clarity, awe. In some ways, what we're describing is our action in the experience. So I in no way have an understanding of my experiences of the divine as some person acting on me, but rather me as someone infleshed with divinity, who is permeable to that infleshment, permeable to that incarnation, permeable to what's going on around me in the physical world. So what I'm describing in a way is a different state of being in relationship to the whole. I say that again slowly, right? Some of you are shaking your heads and some of you are looking at me like, what? So what I'm describing is not an experience in which an outside sky god says, hey, you, here I am. That's not what I'm describing. What I'm describing is a moment when I am fully conscious of who I am and my full humanity, which includes divinity. And so, of course, we need new words to talk about how these experiences happen, what they are, where they come from. But for me, what I'm left with at the end of one of those experiences is that overwhelming longingness for relationship to that wholeness that I have just been opened up to. The word open came up there. Focused, fullness, completeness. So for me, when someone says, teach me to pray, I hear my own longing for that experience of being permeable to the whole, to that which is beyond me, to that which is in, with, through, and beyond me. Because let's face it, we talk about God being in, with, through, and beyond us, but that's a lot to take in a life, right? I mean, I don't spend my whole day fully conscious of that. I have moments where I'm permeable to that reality. Bruce.
Just commenting on your comment, there's the philosophical concept that it's nothing but physiological. That's the nothing but a reason phrase, but it's more than that. You can describe a cathedral just in terms of the silica and the composition of the rock itself, but if you only see that and you don't see the cathedral, you're missing out at another level of consciousness.
And that's where the word that Andrew is always reminding me of, art, comes in. And so I think for a large part of my life, I was focused on the mechanics of prayer, the mechanics of religion, the mechanics of spirituality as my way in, and instead of the appreciation of the art of prayer and the art of spirituality and the art of religion and the art of science. Yes?
On this topic that you and Ann and Bruce were talking about, if one's thinking that it's just physiological, it just is kind of inappropriately negative, that it doesn't diminish it, there's more there. But it seems to me that if one were to take the view that it is just physiological, that opens the door to the possibility that there's nothing to be permeable to. Mm-hmm. It's solely within the head. It's not that what's happening physiologically is tied in with the outside one's body, but that it's happening solely within one's brain. Period. Nothing else beyond. So to me that it is relevant. Mm-hmm. Whether that saying that it's just physiological opens the door to saying just means there's nothing else beyond there.
Okay, and so I would hear that differently. I would hear it's just physiological as opening me to the, well, let me go back to the example that Marcus Borg used, the fish in water. If one is permeable to everything that is around us, the clear divisions and boundaries that we create in our heads at purely a cellular level are not as clear as the boundaries that we have created. So if you want to understand this on a purely physiological basis, then eventually one goes out from one's own physical presence into the air that we breathe, and how that's related to the cosmos. I mean, it's a layered understanding. And if that's what these experiences do for us, then there's benefit to finding out what mechanically is going on. And I don't mean mechanically in that way, but what is going on scientifically. So science is a way of knowing. And it has its own art and skill. Now, I realize scientists may not want to be described of as practicing an art. They once embraced that definition, and some still do. But I think what we need to get away from are these artificial designations that we've said if we're talking scientifically, we're not also talking about being opened up to that which is beyond us. So, without getting into all the details of that, we were going to get to the Lord's Prayer today, but we're not going to. What I want to do is to look at prayer as an art form which opens us, helps us to become more permeable to that which in our everyday lives appears to be beyond us. even though it breaks in at times and pierces our consciousness. So that's what I'm hoping we can do, because all art needs to be practiced, and there are bits and pieces that we can do, places we can position ourselves, so that we are open to that which is beyond us. And so when I hear teach us to pray, I hear, how do I become more open? And I hear that longing for the experience. And so I think that over the generations we have had various different practitioners of the art of prayer who have given us huge gifts in terms of how to open ourselves to that which is beyond and to practice the art of prayer. So what my hope is that we can begin that by looking at what's commonly known as the Lord's Prayer. We're going to start there because I think it does that in interesting ways. And I'm just going to give you a teaser because we're supposed to end in about a minute or so. But the teaser is this. I used to feel the Lord's Prayer was a bit of a barrier to me because I read it as a social justice statement. And it wasn't about prayer. It wasn't about how I should pray. And I was a bit disappointed with Jesus, quite frankly, that he didn't teach us how to practice this art a little better. Our Father who art in heaven just didn't do it for me. It wasn't until I met a friend of mine and we were having this conversation because he's a Hindu, and he was talking about Christian prayer, and he knew way more about Christian prayer than I did. And so I sort of sat at his feet and listened while he talked about the prayer which Jesus taught. But what he did was he practiced the art of telling the story in a way that opened it to me. And here's just a teaser, and we'll get into it next week a little bit. He talked about the time in which we hear about this happening. Jesus has heard that his cousin John the Baptist has had his head lopped off, and his disciples are saying, "Who are you, Jesus? We need to know who you are." And Jesus says, "I've been telling you all along who I am. You still don't get it." And they said, "Look, if we had the stuff that John the Baptist followers had, maybe we could figure out what it is you're trying to say." John the Baptist followers, they had a prayer. They had a prayer that they prayed. And you need to teach us a prayer. Teach us how to pray. And Jesus said, for crying out loud. There was nothing in Jesus that wanted to teach them a prayer. You still don't get it. Okay, here, listen to me. If you have to have a prayer to learn this one. And then he proceeds to teach them the Lord's Prayer, which is so radical and so earth-shattering that if we would only but read it, we would get a hint that Jesus was saying there was so much more to this art of prayer. He wasn't saying, pray like this, the way we pray it. And so that's the teaser. We'll get into the details of that next week. We're going to use, if you want to get a heads up, Dom Crossan's The Greatest Prayer is going to sort of be the basis from which we're going to jump off. We're going to float around in the Lord's Prayer and see what it can teach us about practicing the art of being open to that which we long for, this wholeness, this completeness, all those characteristics you labeled there. An experience with, as some of the mystics would call it, an experience with our lover, our beloved, our lover, and love itself. Thank you.